Good evening and welcome to 31 Horror Nights. It's October 1st and tonight's classic is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. When I was forming this list, there were a lot of older movies that were going to be on the docket. Nosferatu, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, the original Dracula, King Kong. But as I kept thinking of other more recent movies, they kept getting knocked off the list. But I figured that there had to be at least one really old movie that I'm going to be watching for this 31 Horror Nights. And if you want old school, if you want influential, if you want groundbreaking, it's kind of hard to go wrong with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Made in 1920, it's widely regarded as the first horror movie ever made. So, how does it hold up almost 100 years later? It's okay. I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a silent movie, so it pretty much had to bank almost solely on the atmosphere it created in order to be memorable at all as a scary movie. And I think it did a pretty good job of that. I really like the sets in this movie. Everything in the background kind of looks like almost like Tim Burton-esque, but it's like dark, it's angly, things aren't at like proper angles to each other. It's like cramped, it's weird, but it's really interesting to look at and it does help with the atmosphere a lot. The plot of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is that this guy is telling a story about something that happened in his past. There's this guy who was like, I forget if he was like a traveling like magician or something, but he had this act where there's this sleepwalker, they exclusively call him the somnambulist, who he basically has made a slave who'll do anything he can. He can like tell fortunes or whatever. And that doctor, the Dr. Caligari, the guy who owns the sleepwalker, uses that sleepwalker to commit murders in the town. One thing I do want to say is that the guy that they picked to play Caligari himself is pretty good. He's a really good, like, creepy old man kind of guy, but there's also kind of like that playful whimsy to him that I do like and does suit this part very well. One thing I kind of realized about silent movies is that it's a bit of a balancing act. You don't want the people in your movie to be playing charades so the audience can follow what's going on. But on the other hand, you also don't want to force your audience to read the movie. So you need to sort of strike a balance between telling what you want to get across with images and using the word cards when needed. And I think that this movie did a pretty good job with that. There were a couple times where I feel like they could have used a word card that they didn't have one, but you're pretty well able to guess what's happening in a scene from the context. One thing, I don't know if this is like protocol or something for silent movies, but I always thought that like you see the actors say the line and then when they're done talking, then the word card comes up. But in this one, the word card like comes in while they're talking, and then when it's over, they keep going. And at the beginning, I thought there was going to be another word card, like they would keep talking, and then another one would come up. But no, it's the same line. That was a little weird, but that's probably just because I'm not used to it. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is by no means a scary movie. I don't even think it was scary at the time of its release, but it does have good atmosphere. It's eerie in a lot of places. And I do like the style of it, and I do have to give it credit for being quite literally the first of its kind. What I think is the best part of the movie is something that I'm going to have to talk about in the spoiler section of the video, but I would say that if you're interested, check this out. It's pretty short, it's like 75 minutes, and it is interesting to see where horror movies began. It certainly stands the test of time more than Birth of a Nation, that's for damn sure. Alright, spoilers for a 100-year-old movie start now. What I consider to be the best part of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is its twist ending. Now, I was aware going into this that this movie sort of pioneered the untrustworthy narrator archetype. A good example of that is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. The narrator of that story is clearly insane, so you don't know how much of this you're supposed to actually believe. And I knew that that was part of the twist, but I didn't know the details of what exactly the twist in this movie was. Now, while I was watching this, I sort of formed the assumption that Francis is the name of the character, the man who was telling this story about the stuff that was happening in the murders, and I thought that the twist was that he was the one committing the murders, and like he framed Caligari for this, or like this was a story that he made up to tell people because he's crazy. And that's not too far off from what the twist actually was, but it did surprise me by being something else. As it turns out, like, he finishes telling the story, and, like, he gets up, and at the end of the story itself, they find out that Caligari is also the director of an asylum, and they like expose him as the person who's been making the sleepwalker go around and kill people. And the story ends with Caligari being like thrown in a straitjacket and like being locked away in the asylum. And the story ends, and like he gets up and like they move on, and the next scene is them in the courtyard of the asylum, and you see the sleepwalker, Cesare, I think is how you say it, and they're not like horrified of him. He's just sort of there, and he also goes up to the person he claims is his fiance, but their interaction doesn't sound right at all. And then Caligari comes out of the building, and Francis freaks out, and he starts screaming that that's Caligari, that's the murderer, and nobody is like freaking out. And it's revealed that everything you heard was a delusion by Francis. Like, it makes sense because all the characters in the story were other people in the asylum. And he's freaking out, saying that that's Caligari. Like, you think I'm crazy. He's crazy, but he's actually the crazy one. And Caligari really is just the director of that asylum. And the movie ends the same way that the story ended, except it's Francis being tied up in a straitjacket and being restrained. Now, twists work really well when they take a very basic assumption that the audience has and proving that was never true. And I actually wasn't aiming high enough in my prediction, because I, at the very least, thought that what was being described more or less did happen. But no, none of it was real. And I kind of realized that the outside of the asylum, when you go inside, it kind of looks different, but the outside doesn't look like the sets in the rest of the movie. It's not like angular and pointy and dark. It looks like a normal building. And that's kind of linking it to the fact that when you see this world of like tilted buildings and like sharp angles and darkness, that's you going into the world that this madman has created for himself. And that's really interesting. It's not a spectacular movie. It probably was a spectacular movie at the time of its release, and it does hold up to the test of time, but it's not one of the greatest movies ever made or anything like that. I don't think it warrants the 100% rating it has on Rotten Tomatoes. Though I did think it was interesting and is good in its own right. And one last thing I wanted to say is that this is by far the oldest movie I'm going to be watching for the classic 31 Horror Nights. The next oldest one is from 1955. So this was like a good like starting point, like a springboard to get into the rest of the classics. And I'm really excited for that. I'll see you tomorrow.